Hey guys, welcome to Wood.Work.LIFE. In today's hand tool shootout, we're going to look at every furniture maker and carpenter's best friend, the block plane. This ubiquitous tool can be found in tool belts, in toolboxes, and on benches all over the world, and used for countless functions inside a shop and in the field. We're going to look at four good tools and one that doesn't really deserve to be here, put these through their paces, and try to understand some of the criteria you might want to know for picking out one of these to put in your own tool belts or in your own toolbox. So for today's shootout, I have the Kobalt block plane. It's a $15 plane that you can find at that, really big blue box store that you'll see on every street corner in a major city. So you can go check that out. It's basically a copy of a Stanley or a Record 60.5. Uses maybe a little bit lower quality materials and built to a little bit wider tolerances than you would get from the classic Stanley or Record planes. I also have my own personal sidearm, the Veritas DX60. This is a really fine hand plane with really high quality manufacturing processes, has a lot of the features of the old Record and Stanley planes, but is machined to a lot tighter tolerances. It also has the Norris adjuster, which I find to be a little bit more secure holding of the blade. This is, of course, the plane that I use every day, so I might have a little bias towards it, but I'm going to try to not show that as much. Next, I borrowed a couple from my buddy Ralph over at consultingwoodworker.com. He lent me a Lie Nielsen left-handed skew plane and a Veritas right-handed skew plane. The Lie Nielsen actually also has a fence, so you can use it as a rabbet plane or a tenon plane. And the Veritas does have an open end, so you can use it as a rabbeting plane. Both of these are really nice, very similar mechanisms, only the Veritas still maintains a adjustable throat even as a skew plane. The Veritas throat is fixed, although it shouldn't cause many issues. It's fixed at a pretty decent size. Finally, we have this load of junk. This is something I picked up at a garage sale for $5. I really just wanted to get you an example of what not to buy. You can get these in the kit for $15 with a smoothing plane from Harbor Freight, something like this anyway. This is an older example, something of an older vintage. It's made out of incredibly thin steel, so even when you're just tightening down the blade retention mechanism, it's actually going to flex the sole of the plane, and you want to keep that sole flat. And that's just one of the problems with rolled steel versus cast steel or cast iron. Secondly, retention mechanism for the iron doesn't actually hold the iron square with the sole, and there's no way to adjust that. You can tap it with a hammer and what have you, but in a tool belt or just hanging around in a toolbox, that's going to be really easy for that to come out of adjustment. And no real predictability with the results there. It can skew the iron and then all of a sudden take a big old chunk out of your work. Nothing that you really want to deal with. Finally, it's got way too big of a throat to do any sort of finished work. Generally, your block plane is going to be taking those last couple shavings off of a cabinet door or last couple shavings off the end of a board just to get it perfectly to fit where you're going. And you generally don't have the space to operate with sandpaper or taking off micro shavings to get that smooth finished surface. So the block plane is usually the last plane to touch a piece of work. So with that in mind, I would want my block plane to be able to do finished work, and this is not really capable of that. So let's just disregard him from here on out. And now on to the tests. We're going to put these through 6 trials to see how they handle some basic functions that you want a block plane to do. First of all, you have the setup and sharpening. How easy is that to do and how accurate can they get? What the finish looks like off the blade and how smooth it is taking a shaving with it. Working with tenons, rabbets, and half laps, so how good it is at tuning up joinery. Next is going to be shooting end grain, because that's something that these are used most common for cleaning up end grain on a cabinet or on a bottom of a door. And then finally, how they handle weird grain orientations, where the grain's going every which way through a board. A bevel up plane is supposed to be able to handle that better. So let's jump right into those tests and see how these things make out. First, I wanted to check the flatness of these planes. I used my DMT diamond stones that are certified dead flat. I took a couple of strokes on the 4000 grit mesh and checked the bottom for any dull spots that weren't touched by the stone. The Lie Nielsen and both Veritas planes suction cupped to the stone and had no perceivable dull spots after a few strokes. I checked with Ralph from consultingwoodworker.com, and he confirmed he hadn't done any prep on the sole of his planes, and beyond initially checking mine for flat, neither had I. Next, I checked out the Kobalt plane. As expected with a $15 plane, it was slightly out of flat. Well, in this case, it was a little more than slightly out of flat.
but I'm sure for 15 bucks this varies from plane to plane and some might be better than mine. One issue that added a lot of work for the flattening was trying to get the adjustable part of the sole flat with the rest of the sole. Something about the adjustment mechanism might be throwing it off. It's important to get the bottom of the sole flat because otherwise you'll only be taking shavings from the highest spot on the sole. When the sole is slightly hollow, that's fine. But when it has a belly like this one did, this can cause a lot of problems. So I had to put a lot of work into it to get it flat. I would hope that for just a few dollars more, a modern version of the Stanley 60.5 might be a little better out of the box. It costs about $45 more, but it's still less than half the price of the next cheapest plane I'm looking at today. Once I had checked all the soles for flat, I wanted to look at the sharpening and tuning of the planes. I first started out sharpening the skew planes. Sharpening a skew plane is one of the most precise sharpening tasks you can train yourself to do. The skew and bevel angles needed to be matched perfectly. There aren't any off-the-shelf jigs that can help you with this task, so the best way to go about it is to get really good at hand sharpening. Once the blade is sharp, the Veritas does have a slight leg up on the Lie Nielsen, and that it has several retaining screws you can use to ever so slightly cant the blade into alignment with the sole and the shoulder of the plane. These are really finicky though, and adjustments to all these are dependent of each other. I wouldn't suggest a skew plane like this one to be your first hand plane purchase, as nice as they are. Next, it was time to sharpen the Veritas and Kobalt low-angle blocks. These are super easy and straightforward whether you sharpen them with a jig or by hand. Most standard block planes have a lateral adjustment that can account for any skew you may accidentally sharpen into your irons. I made a video about my whole sharpening system with these stones, and I'll link to it here. The only thing in it between these two planes is really personal preference. I prefer the Norris adjustment mechanism in the Veritas, but I know just as many people who prefer the old Stanley mechanism. Now, the Veritas does have the same retention screws, and this is just another cutting-edge feature that Veritas adds to their planes. For the smoothing portion of the shootout, I worked with some common woods. A little bit of construction lumber, some walnut, just a little bit of everything, just to put these planes through their paces. I tried taking super thin shavings, super thick shavings, and everything in between. I kept the soles of all the planes well waxed to make sure they had minimal resistance in all the woods. Two things really stood out on the negative side. When the side of the Lie Nielsen plane is removed, the nicker sometimes interfered with the planing and left tracks in the wood. Also on the Kobalt, even after flattening, the precision of the adjustment mechanisms still prevented me from taking those wispy shavings I was able to get with the rest of the planes. The winner overall of this challenge was the Veritas skew plane, but only by the narrowest of margins over the DX60. Tied for first. For joinery tasks like trimming faces or shoulders of tenons, rabbets, and half-laps, this is really a two-horse race since none of the other planes had the ability to plane into a corner. There was really nothing in it from a performance perspective between the Veritas and the Lie Nielsen skew planes. The only thing I really learned from this was that if you're right-handed and like to tune joints in a vise, buy a left-handed skew plane, and if you like to work on your bench with bench hooks and holdfasts, buy a right-handed skew plane. If you're a lefty, do the opposite. Beyond that, it's another tie between the Veritas right-handed skew and the Lie Nielsen left-handed skew. For planing end grain, I could go through a bunch of hyperbole about which one of these felt best in the hand and how smoothly they felt like they were going through the wood, but I think that story is best told by just listening to them as they go through this piece of walnut. I thought one of the skew planes was going to take this, but to my ears, the DX60 just edged out the Veritas right-handed skew plane. I don't know though, do you think one of the other ones sounded smoother? The final test here is to look at how these planes handle twisting and changing direction grain, as well as super hardwoods. I looked through my offcuts bin and I pulled out a piece of sycamore with all kinds of crazy quarter-sawn grain, a piece of walnut from right where the grain changes direction, and a piece of the hardest wood I can easily get my hands on, Osage orange. Surprisingly, all the planes handled the Osage pretty well. I guess it was the low angle and bevel up plane. They all left a smooth, waxy finish and no tear out. The sycamore, on the other hand, actually posed a pretty serious challenge to all the planes except for the Veritas right-handed skew plane. So the winner of this challenge was definitely the Veritas right-handed skew plane.
All right, so what did I learn from all this? Well, I learned that the Veritas right-handed skew plane is a very versatile performer, and the fact that you don't have to remove that side of the plane to use it for doing joinery is really useful and really makes for a great tool. But overall, I'm not going to go around and buy any of these. I think the DX60 that I have is a very capable plane and can do almost anything I need it to do besides joinery with the skew planes. Additionally, the Kobalt doesn't really stack up to what you can get from a high dollar plane. I'd be really interested to see what some of the mid-range, classic or antique planes like an old Stanley 60.5 or an old Record 60.5 could do when you compare them to something like this. I think if you put some time into the Kobalt, it could be a good performer, but I just don't think the upside's there to really be a great value. If I were to buy any of these planes to add some versatility to my hand tool arsenal, it would have to be the right-handed skew plane from Veritas. But again, if you're going to be working in a vise, maybe look at a left-handed skew plane. But I think the Veritas with the set screws and some of the newer innovations in the tool, as well as the adjustable throat, really just has a lot more versatility than its competitor from Lie Nielsen, especially since with the Lie Nielsen you have to remove the side of the plane to be able to use it for joinery. So those are just my 2 cents. If you were to go buy a plane today, what would you buy? Let me know in the comments. And if you enjoyed this video, please like and subscribe down below. So thanks for watching today, and remember to keep your tools sharp and keep your mind sharper.